Okay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Humeira Iqtidar. I am a professor of politics in the Department of Political Economy, King's College London.
Thank you so much for being with us, Prof. Now, I can see behind you, on the one hand, unlike my background, which is faux, lots of books and articles, and they look properly organized, but at the same time, leaning a little bit to show that they're actually used. But that's over your left shoulder, but over your right shoulder, I can see part of a photograph that looks interesting and not maybe very contemporary. Any chance you would tell me about the photo?
Well, this is a photograph that has been relegated to my study because everybody else thinks it is too macabre. It is actually a contemporary photograph of Lahore, the city that I grew up in Pakistan. And it's taken from inside a bombed out building, looking outside onto a very affluent neighborhood. And so this, to me, it speaks of that particular period in Lahore. Lahore is generally a very safe city. So, this photograph should not suggest that it's not a safe city. There was a period where it was subject to, this was after the US-led NATO attack in Afghanistan in 2001 onwards, and some of that instability of the war in Afghanistan spilled out into Pakistan and into this part of Pakistan, Lahore as well. This was relatively short-lived, but yes, so, the alternative, and one has, because of the South Asian heritage of miniature painting, many friends and family tend to have these, very beautiful renditions of the Mughal architecture in Lahore, or renditions of old city, etc. So this is not a romantic photograph, but it seems to me this is also the Lahore that I have known and loved, with all its beauty, but also these aspects to it.
And it's fascinating in class terms to be seeing through a bombed out building onto an affluent area.
That's right. Yes. So this, the kind of dynamics of who gets bombed and who doesn't, I think the photograph also captures that quite well.
Right. Well, now that I've asked you about those things, can I get to my standard query, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you?
The last week has made it really difficult to focus on other work, because what I see happening out right now, especially, of course, with reference to the Middle East, is a war of imperial aggression that is really unchecked, apart from the resistance that, however problematic the regime in Iran is able to put up at this point. And this is worrying at various levels, including the fact that no longer is there any interest in building a multilateral coalition. No longer is there any interest on the part of the US and Israel in setting up a kind of a consensus around this, in taking the UN on board and thinking about legalities. And it is a very dangerous war that can spill out, and is already spilling out in very problematic ways. So the main concern, as generals in England, in America, have also highlighted, is that it doesn't seem to have a clear end goal. And any such war, we have examples again and again of such wars. We know that these wars are hugely devastating for the people who are involved in them, the ordinary persons who are involved in them. So I guess, this is not necessarily something that I work on. I don't work on the Middle East directly, but understanding global politics and understanding the implications of such actions means that actually it's been very hard to walk away from what is happening in front of our screens at this moment.
I remember in the second or third stanza, as it were, of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, middle-ranking US military officials were given two books to help them understand what they were involved in. One was The Clash of Civilizations. The other was Islam for Dummies. Now, I've not read Islam for Dummies, but my guess is it may have been more useful than The Clash of Civilizations. And my guess is that they're not given anything to read now because books.
Yes, well, it is. I haven't read Islam for Dummies either, and even though you're right that in some ways maybe it had more kind of factual basis, perhaps for some of their assertions, but it's hard to know. And actually, one of the problems I think in terms of the way the war on terror has been framed for the last 25 years and the various wars that have been waged as part of that framing is that there's a very simplified version of Islam, the wider Islamic tradition that people have operated with. And so Islam for Dummies may actually be doing more harm as well, because it is very easy to pick up from a tradition, any tradition of thought and practice that is 1400 years old. You will get a whole host of things, ideas, practices within that. And this is not to say that we should only pick up what we like. In fact, I think it's very important that we understand and engage with those aspects of such a tradition as well, that we may not agree with, that we may find deeply problematic. But it is the fact that any tradition of thought will, if it's a living, vibrant tradition of thought, will have contradictions in it, will have different perspectives built into it. And that allows people to debate or to interpret in multiple ways. So as somebody who works on the wider Islamic tradition, I suspect both books were deeply damaging. And not quite sure if Islam for Dummies is also a good choice.
Well, I've not read it, so I don't know, but I know what I think about The Clash of Civilizations.
Yes.
Prof, this leads me on to something that makes you, I think, a bit different from the orthodox political theorist in that you combine ethnography with political theory. And even though, of course, Kant did that, for example,
That's right.
or he
Yeah.
thought he did. I mean, he never moved more than about 6 inches from where he was born, but he thought
Yes.
he was combining ethnography and political theory. And in fact, probably without realizing it, lots of people do, but you do it overtly. Can you talk a bit about here's an awkward word I'm using, the marriage of those two? What are the benefits? What are the costs? What's the richness? What's the difficulty of bringing those two together? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and that's one of my favorite topics to talk about as well. So it is interesting that you bring up Kant, because Kant actually doesn't carry out ethnography himself, of course, although he also taught and what we then now think of as anthropology, but he relied on ethnographic accounts by others, including missionaries in different parts of the world, to come up with this universal kind of moral philosophy. And there is a danger that if we think of that as ethnography, the danger is that the real benefit of ethnography, I think, is that the researcher gets questioned. We get asked and pushed back on the assumptions that we hold, the kinds of conclusions that we're moving towards. And I think it's really important for political theorists in particular, because for a long time, political theory as a discipline has remained kind of secluded from these real world conversations, especially beyond Euro-America. So we have seen that as a discipline, political theory, for instance, did not engage extensively or in any depth with the question of colonialism and imperialism, even though historians were doing that, anthropologists were doing that, and partly they were doing this because they had to move out of the university, to be in archives, to talk to people. And this is not to say that anthropologists and historians have had a perfect, way of engaging with other people, or it's not to say that these disciplines are perfect and political theory is not. It's just to say that maybe we should pause and think about what the methodological repertoire that political theorists rely upon does to the kinds of questions that we ask. And so I completely understand that not all political theorists will be interested in carrying out ethnography, but I think it's important that the new generation of political theorists coming up should think about this as an important element, as an important part of the methodological repertoire that they can draw upon. Because one of the things that political theory, that ethnography or engagement, whether we think about this as ethnography, participant observation, or oral histories, one of the things they do is that this allows us to really be pushed in very firm ways by others who don't agree with us. And I think political theorists have this kind of vision of themselves as clarifying public debates, but they often actually don't directly engage in public debates. We're often writing for other scholars and for each other. And we don't really have those ready channels of engagement with people outside of academia. So this is an important way of doing that. So texts don't question us. And this is the title of one of the chapters that I've also written, or an article that I've written, which is, text can also open up new worlds for us. Of course, read with care, read with attention, texts from other spaces, from other parts of the world do have the opportunity and do have the potential for really making us rethink deeply held normative commitments or conceptual frameworks. But actually, nothing like people pushing back and saying, no, I think what you're thinking or what you're saying is wrong, or based on my experience, this seems to be a limited way of thinking about the world. So I think as we want to open political theory up to being much more relevant to contemporary political life, ethnography becomes a very important tool for us to be able to do that. That looks good.
I couldn't agree more. Gracias, muy amable. Yes, the prof, as with some other of my guests, is being very tolerant in that she is sitting studiously in her study, surrounded by literature, and I'm staring at poached eggs and avocado and toast, and I'm going to consume them, but I...
Very unfair arrangement.
Very unfair. Quite right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned, as did I, that Kant didn't actually go to these places, because Durkheim is another example, a century and a half later, where his understanding of how to comprehend the basics of social structure is based on other people's ethnographies of first peoples in colonized countries, because he thinks that modernity in the form of industrialization and representative democracy has actually blinded people to understanding what holds things together. And you can only see this if you go to these other nations. And he based a lot of his ideas on that. Of course, so does Freud.
Yes, well, Freud doesn't explicitly acknowledge as much, but say Durkheim and Weber both were beginning to recognize that, the kinds of visions of modernity that they are working with may have very limited reach. And I think, I guess really to think about the project that is really animating me at this point is linked to this question that we have tended for almost a century or so, since Durkheim, Weber, and others, to think about the globe, what we, for want of a better word, call the global South, as a site for problems, as a site from where we generate questions and maybe where solutions, where problems are based, and somehow the solutions will come from Euro-America or from the theoretical frameworks that we already have. And I really think that we're getting to that point where there's enough, in a sense, critical mass behind this idea to start thinking about much more explicitly thinking about the solutions that also are made available to us if we engage deeply and with an open mind with global South context. So this works in different ways. One is, of course, that there are there are moments in which, or there are debates within the global south that actually clarify the kinds of debates and political problems that we may face even in Euro-America, so they help clarify them better. And then I think also there are other ideas and practices in, for instance, for my case, South Asia, that are actually providing some really interesting solutions to contemporary political problems, or if not solutions, but at least alternatives to contemporary political problems. So one of the things that I've been looking at recently is the ways in which migrants and refugees from what are called the tribal areas in Pakistan imagine justice and their practices of justice. And we know that migration, global migration, is primarily contained within the global south. So even though there's a lot of debate in America, in Europe about migration and immigration, but in fact, the vast majority of refugees and migrants in the world are actually absorbed within the global south. They don't actually come to Europe and North America. So I wanted to shift the focus about these kind of discussions about migration, but also to think with these refugees and migrants from the tribal areas who were displaced because of the war going on in Afghanistan, spilling over onto the tribal areas which are just on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so these migrants then moved to other cities within Pakistan. And, they were not easily welcomed in those urban contexts, because there was a wider discourse of the tribal being militant, tribal people not really educated, not really, almost as if they were primitives who had weapons. And this was part of the narrative that the government of Pakistan and the government of the US also constructed, saying, these militants are these kind of strange people. We can't have a conversation with them. We cannot have any kind of discussion with them. And the only way to treat them, or the only way to deal with them, is to send in drones, is to send in armies, because these people are otherwise there's impervious to modern, rational, logical thinking. And that discourse had been in place for about 5 to 6 years when these refugees and migrants from the tribal areas started spilling into the urban context. So many people in urban Pakistan were also very skeptical towards them. And they faced what we would today recognize as racism. They were not given, homes to rent. They were often discriminated against by the police in particular. Many of them were peasants and working class people. So they faced all of the kind of marginalization that goes with being a peasant or a working class person in Pakistan, but also that kind of ethnic marginalization that was also happening. And so within that, this I wanted to understand what they thought justice would mean and how they might have operationalized that. I should give you a moment to come in, perhaps. I see you nodding.
You're covering for me, because each mouthful I'm taking, you're realizing that's a cue to go on to a next paragraph. I am indebted to you immensely, Prof. Now, I don't have access to your books because I work in the global south, and we just don't have that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have access to some of your articles. So I've done my best to educate myself. And one of there are a couple of fascinating aspects that I may relate to what you're describing already, I think. And one of them is, forgive my pronunciation, please correct it, Haq.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is how it's pronounced.
It doesn't look like it's a tough one, but you never know. So that seems to me...
What is it?
Well, I think yes, tell us what it is, but also how it's useful beyond, along with associated concepts that you engage, its utility, as it were, its applicability beyond its point of origin. I think this is your wider point, right? About the ethnographic and the political theoretical intersecting. Can I go back to the toast now?
The avocado, of course. The fresh avocado. Yeah, so thank you. That is a very useful question for me to elaborate upon. So haq has sometimes, in existing scholarship, been translated as the equivalent of right. And so it is seen to be an important element of a vision of justice. Yet I show that this, if we work through the ways in which both my tribal interlocutors and in the wider Islamic tradition, haq has been thought of, then we realize that there is a very profound difference between the kind of liberal statist rights regime that people have tended to translate haq as, and the actual other vision of justice that is not implemented by the state, not necessarily dependent upon state legislation, that is also opened up to us. So haq means both right and obligation. It can be used both for the individual and the collective. And it is also something that belongs to both the oppressed and the oppressor. So I may say to you, and many of my interlocutors, for instance, said to me that it was the haq of the Pakistani government to not bomb us because we are also citizens of Pakistan. Why did they bomb us? Why did they allow the Americans to send in drones or airplanes to bomb us? So when they said something like this, it initially sounded counterintuitive to me because they were saying, if you translate haq as right, then they were saying it was the right of the Pakistani government to not bomb us. And it didn't really make sense. But if you think within the framework that they are talking about, haq is both entitlement and obligation. So in liberal political theory and liberal legal debates, we have tended to associate right only with entitlement and not with obligation, whereas haq combines both obligation and entitlement. But the main point, I think, was, and I can kind of discuss with examples if that helps, but the main thing that I realized is that for most of my working class peasant interlocutors, not so much for the more kind of educated or urbanized people from tribal areas who'd been in the tribal areas, in the urban centers for longer, for most of my peasant and working class interlocutors, haq meant that they were basically looking for rebuilding relationships with others, with their neighbors, with their co-workers, wherever they were based, in Lahore, in Islamabad, in the major urban centers, and getting them to recognize what they had just gone through and organizing a space for themselves in these urban centers. So what this meant was that they felt that they had a lot more agency in this conception of justice. This was not state-enforced justice. This was not revenge on the entities that had carried out this, had been responsible for the displacement, etc. But this was a recognition of them as human beings, as having obligations and entitlements, of them being able to help as well as receive help. And so this was really a socialized vision of justice. And I am still working through the implications of, if it's not revenge, if it's not punishment of those who did you harm, etc., then how is this justice? Because we're so used to thinking about justice as something that allows this kind of punitive that comes with punishment effectively. So it's not that, but it does open a lot of questions, and it does help us think about the fact that for many around the world, and literally, if you think about it, as I started looking into this, I realized that this is a concept and a set of practices that is important all the way from North Africa to the Middle East, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia, all parts of the world where Islamic concepts and Islamic debates have traveled or have a life. the use of haq goes beyond Muslim population. So in India, for instance, we see, lower caste Hindu women using the vocabulary of haq to also claim a place for themselves in society. So it's often aimed not at changing state laws, but actually changing the behavior of those who are around us. And we have, because of the liberal imagination, we have tended to believe that the best way, the most efficient way of changing the behavior of those around us is through state laws. But actually, thinking with haq allows us to think about the fact that there are ways of imagining these transformations that do not rely upon the state. And as I say this, I realize that for many people, this is immediately, it sounds like a libertarian vision, right? It's like, oh, don't bring the state in. We don't want the state. But that is not what my interlocutors, I mean, first of all, they have no investment in libertarianism as an ideology that is, much more kind of developed and framed based on European experiences. And there is a real sense of a moral agency, of collective action. They're not focusing on the individual. So there's a difference with libertarianism. They're not saying this is about individual freedom. They're saying this is about collective justice for us. This is about not just me, but my extended family, my clan, people from my tribe. This is about justice for all of us, but it is imagined in a way that doesn't rely upon state enforcement. And so if you think about that vast swathe of people that I've mentioned, this is already billions of people. I mean, India, South Asia itself is 1.5 billion, right? So we are talking about billions of people who have actually some engagement with, some understanding, some association with this concept of haq already, this vision of non-status justice already. And it doesn't mean that we don't organize movements and mobilizations for status change as well, but it does mean that we recognize that there are other visions of justice that also provide kind of meaning to people's mobilizations and engagements. So that's a very long answer. I see you finish your avocado.
I have, and I'm jonesing for the cup of tea that I'm not going to get. But I want to suggest that there are actually things here in common with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not with US political theorists, because political science in the US is one of the most pitiful disciplines in the history of the world, although it's changing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in that the lowercase r Republican notion of virtue is enormously powerful there. And the third sector or civil society is immense there.
Right.
And not libertarian at all. It's very collectivist, but it is not statist.
Yes.
And in addition to that, and this may not be so much the case in political theory, capital P, capital T, but in the incarnation of political theoretical ideas in political practice and the bourgeois media, rights and responsibilities are absolutely tethered in the United States.
Right.
Monumentally. And entitlements are regarded as something else that can easily be lost. Right? That also has a legal status. So I guess I'm suggesting not that the United States has all of this, but that it is rather different from Western Europe.
Yes.
In the way
You're right.
some of these ideas are connected to everyday life rather than government. Does that make sense to you at all?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So there are two things that I would like to kind of build upon based on what you just said. One is the fact that, there is a distinction between how political ideas that kind of give meaning to political life and what academic political theorists talk about. And it is important for us to make sure that we actually are keeping a real eye on that, because sometimes it's very easy for us to get caught up in our own conversations and lose sight of the ways in which and as you just said, exactly, if we look at political ideas in practice, we see that there is a greater expectation amongst American populations as well of some relationship between rights and obligations, some relationship or some a much more fractured relationship with the state than perhaps in Europe, where the welfare state has meant that people have a very different relationship. Also within the American context, actually, it's important, and I discuss this in some of my work as well, in a paper and a new book that's coming out with Cambridge University Press, that Native Americans are also really worried, and this is one of the argument that many Native Americans have also made, that what would it mean for them to demand justice or to have justice from a state that they don't recognize, right? So for them, the American state is a settler colonial state. They are living with that state, not all, but many of them argue that we are living with that state under sufferance. It is not a state that represents us. It is not a state that we ever agreed to have impose its laws on us. And so if we were to actually demand justice from that state in the form of different laws, etc., we are validating that very entity that we oppose. So somebody like Alfred Taeke, who's based now in Canada, but who's kind of tribal or Native association is with lands that go across America and Canada, has made an argument like this, and others have as well. So certainly in the American context, there are different constituencies as well. And one very strong voice that comes through from Native Americans is about, similarly, this very fractured relationship with the state, and not requiring or not thinking, not imagining justice as something that will be enforced by the American state for them.
What's the title of the new book that's about to come out?
The title of the new book is A Haq and Critical Theory. I am still there's a subtitle which I've just forgotten, but it might be something like tribal areas in Pakistan. But I will. Yeah, I've forgotten that, mostly because I'm in the process of rewriting the title. I thought the title needs to be slightly. It was a less direct title.
When my first book was coming out, the publisher asked me, just as they're about to go to press, if I could change the subtitle so that it was something and the postmodern.
Yes, I am. I'm quickly actually looking through through my emails to say what was the last thing? Haq, critical theory, and the global south is what we have at this point.
Now, Prof, one of the other bits of your writing, or there are several bits of writing that talk about this, one in the Graniad, as it is known in Britain, or the Guardian, as it is known in other countries, less familiar with its typographical history, shall we say, constant mistakes. But I've also read a couple of pieces you've written that are scholarly, which is the relationship between secularism and secularization.
Right.
And some of this writing is from quite a long time ago that I've read. But I'm wondering if you could explain something about their relationship, because it seems to me that that's been very important in the dominant discourse of development, particularly political development, of the kind you got from the old Social Sciences Research Council in the United States, but also aid organizations and so on, and may still be very powerful today. Could you give us the scoop on secularism and secularization?
Yes, certainly. So this is part of the first book, and in some ways, of course, these are long-running concerns for me. So the long-running concern, very broadly summed, is the place of religious ideas in contemporary political life. And for my PhD research, I actually initially started with looking at labor unions in Pakistan. And I wanted to construct a critical history of labor unions. There was less work in the Pakistani context at that time. This is early 2000s. And as I spent more time, and again, I was thinking of this as an ethnography to also think about the changes in union work and labor organization. And as I spent more time with them, I realized that actually most of the unions, especially unions in state organizations, were affiliated with one of the larger Islamist parties, Jamaat Islami. And so this long-running association of unions with left politics and in Pakistan, as in many other Muslim countries, through the 1960s and 70s, there had been a real clash between the leftists and the Islamists. The Islamists increasingly then funded by the US, and of course from 1979 onwards, the war in Afghanistan really funded by the US in support for what was then called the Mujahideen and then were later termed as terrorists and Taliban. A lot of that money funneled through Pakistan, and of course, various groups were born at that point. So as I started kind of thinking about what was happening here, why were these groups who were actually antagonistic to each other, why had they merged now? Why were the Islamists basically working in labor unions? And so as I started looking at that, I also started thinking about the long-term effect of Islamists. Islamism is an innovation in Islamic thought and practice that happens really towards the end of late 19th, early 20th century. This is a time, early 20th century, when most political organizations are really being organized around the idea of the state. So the communists, who were very, very influential in the thought of Abul Ala Maududi, the kind of preeminent Islamist ideologue who comes out of British India, the Bolshevik Revolution was really inspiring for people around the world, right? The idea that a monarchy could be overthrown, that society could be transformed in a very profound manner in a relatively short time, these were really profound inspirations for different kinds of thinkers and activists. So the liberal nationalists wanted to take over the state, the communists wanted to take over the state, and the Islamists also articulated a vision of Islam, which meant that to be a good Muslim, you had to be engaged in a political project of taking over the state to transform society. And so in that sense, it's an innovation in Islamic thought and practice. And it was really systematically argued for by the founder of a political party called Jamaat Islami. And so the unions that I was looking at were affiliated primarily with the Jamaat Islami. But through the 40s and 50s, Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami, had imagined this as a vanguard party like the Bolsheviks that would have educated Muslims taking over the state and, transforming society. So it was an interesting puzzle. As I thought about this more, I also realized that the social science frameworks that I had of thinking about what is a secular party, what is the relationship between secularism and democratic politics, the association of secularism with progressive politics. Is it possible that groups that are affiliated with kind of religious organizations may still be, really entrenched in class politics of some kind? So really kind of thinking through those kinds of questions, I argued in my first book, which was called Secularizing Islamists with a question mark, that are the Islamists secularizing? I argued that, first of all, in social science theorizing, we don't have a clear relationship between secularism and secularization. So secularism is the ideology, the state practice, and secularization is the social process. So we have these conflated visions of, and we have a confused idea about what that relationship might be based on a very abstract and reified reading of the European experience. So we have some idea that maybe they developed together, or maybe in some European countries, secularization happened first and then secularism as an ideology emerged. But maybe in others, maybe secularism as an ideology came first and then secularization happened as a social process. We don't really know. And of course, in contemporary imperial projects, secularism actually increasingly comes to stand in for democracy. So, Mohamed Morsi is taken out in Egypt, even though he's very problematic, but he's democratically elected. He's the only democratically elected president that Egypt has. And he's taken out because of the idea that actually, if you're not secular, then you must not also be democratic. But it's fine when we come to European countries. The Christian Democrats in Germany are democratic, but in other parts of the world, these kind of religious mobilizations are inevitably anti-democratic. And I wanted to open that up because I think that if we think about the complicated relationship between secularism and secularization, it becomes possible to see that the ideology or the framing or the state practice of secularism doesn't always lead to secularization, and that secularization doesn't always happen because of secularism. And then there's a further caveat that most social science theorizing has tended to think about secularization as privatization of religion, as the idea that, if secularization happens, people will no longer practice their religiosity in public. And that is tethered to a European experience of religiosity, to an experience of a very hierarchical, very structured Roman Catholic Church, which also inherited an empire in a sense. So the church actually managed a lot of property, managed state behavior in a very intrusive way. And we actually don't have the equivalent of that in most traditions of the world, certainly not in South Asia, certainly not in most parts of, other parts of Asia, certainly not in Africa. So we don't have that kind of historical experience. So in Europe, that breaking away from a very structured hierarchical church, its direct intrusion into who the king married and how the affairs of the state were run, that was a particularly European experience. And breaking away from that was a particularly European need. But something does change with modernity, with colonialism, in how religious ideas are practiced and how practice shapes ideas. And I think that we can think about secularization as something that is, there is some value to thinking with that term, but I think what secularization really is then is not a change in the quantity of religion. We don't become more or less religious. We don't become more or less religious in public or private. It's the quality of religion. It's how we imagine religion. We have started imagining religion as something that is one part of human life, like society, like economy. So the kind of breaking up of human life into different compartments that are obviously never fully sealed, but it's a heuristic device. And we imagine something called religion that has its own dynamics that are separate from the dynamics of this thing called the market or the economy, that is separate from this thing called society. And of course, we actually don't really know where society ends and market starts or state starts or religion starts. But these are, we've kind of started imagining human life in this ways. And so there is something that has happened, which is a qualitative change rather than a quantitative change. And so the argument that I made in that book was to say that actually, paradoxically, even though the Islamists are against the project of secularism, they are against the ideology of secularism, they are unintentionally, the Islamists were not happy with my book. They are unintentionally facilitating secularization because they have taken on the structure of European thinking about these kind of categories of these differentiations within human life. And even though they argue that, religion should permeate all spheres of life, they nevertheless argue that by saying, okay, there are these different categories, and yet this category religion should go across these spheres of life. So that's a very long answer to your relatively short question. But I hope that it helps kind of, because some of this is counterintuitive. At the same time, because the book has a life of its own, many people have taken it up. Its arguments seem to have stood the test of time. So I realized that it's becoming less and less counterintuitive. But when the book first came out in 2011, it certainly felt very counterintuitive to many, because of the close association that we have between secularism, secularization, and democracy.
No, understood. And of course, in the case of the United States, this is immensely complicated by the fact that its contemporary imperialism is so animated by a particular form of right-wing Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That applies whether it is being parlayed by Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama, as much as when it's parlayed by George W. Bush. And their notion of imperialism is resolutely opposed to secularism. This is wicked.
And at the same time, there is a self-conception of Americans that, this is a secular country, as opposed to these primitive Muslim countries that are all theocratic regimes, right? So one of the arguments that, and especially within the war on terror framework, you're absolutely right that there is a very strong, explicit political flavor to Christianity in the US, which is also somewhat unusual for many European countries. And yet, of course, America is one of those few rare countries where there's a constitutionally mandated separation between the state and religion.
Yeah.
And it is really to protect religion.
And yes, I mean, many people say that the problem of such profound religiosity influencing public policy in the United States is precisely because of that prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the people who say that having an official religion like in Britain means you can actually be secular.
Right.
When you say, oh no, we're not having any of that, this in fact animates massive religiosity. That said, of course, one can certainly map the so-called Great Awakenings, the Great Awakenings from the beginning of the 19th century through to now, and see that they all coalesce with massive economic distress.
Yes.
When there's more equilibrium in the United States, there's less religiosity.
Yeah, and I think, I want to also suggest that we have to, this kind of blanket association of religiosity with regressive politics, with right-wing agendas, is also something that we need to open up, because we also have had within Christianity liberation theology, we've had various moves, we've had various groups that have drawn upon Christianity to animate their social justice and political justice campaigns. So I want to open up that and really not just open up, but really break down that close association that we have between religiosity and right-wing politics, and to really think much more empirically as well as theoretically to how do we make sense of these kinds of dynamics. Because again, in some ways, secularization theory was so dominant for most of the 20th century, and then it just falls off because we see the rise of religious voting, bloc voting in America, with Reagan's election in particular. We see, with the Iranian regime, we see the rise of various kinds of religiously motivated voting blocs in European countries, with Hindutva in India. So there's this whole range of mobilizations that refuse to let go of religious ideas and practices. So I don't want to suggest that they're uniformly regressive or uniformly progressive, but that actually religion is a very important element when we are thinking about contemporary politics. And one of the things that I think we can learn from, for instance, South Asia, one of the things that does become available to us is how European societies in particular, but also America to some extent, Euro-American imagination really valorizes homogeneity in political imagination, right? So for most of the 19th and 20th century, actually, homogeneity was what was idealized. And even Locke, who is seen to be this, was much earlier, but Locke, who is seen to be this, theorist of tolerance, is essentially saying think whatever you want to think, practice whatever you practice in your home. But if you are a Catholic, just be a Catholic at home, not in the rest of the Protestant realm or Anglican realm out of England. And if you think about the most of the world, including Mexico, where you're based right now, most parts of the world have lived with more diversity. They've also they are more ethnically, linguistically, religiously diverse than Europe in its own imagination for a long time now. People have been defining Europe as a Christian realm, which erases both the long-running presence of Jews, which is only really recognized after the Holocaust, and of Muslims who were in Europe, ruling Europe for about 700 years before the conquistadors went out, but also have been a part of Europe, through colonialism, through various kinds of centuries already. But the idea that Europe is a homogenized space, this is not empirically, sociologically, historically as accurate as the imagination that has become deeply entrenched that Europe was homogeneous and has only recently been corrupted and opened up to these multiple others. Whereas, in a place like India, and South Asia more generally, Pakistan and India, when they were, what was called British India, early 20th century, multiple religions, multiple ethnic groups, multiple languages. And so trying to imagine what these polities will look like was a much more complicated project, working within the confines of how the nation and democracy was imagined in Europe. So all of this is again, a long answer to say that I think that, if you think about how practices of religious coexistence are even now being practiced in places like India and Pakistan, and I've written about that as well. What are the practices of tolerance that don't require secularism? How have these religiously diverse communities managed to live together without having secularism imposed by the state? And we see that there are various ways in which actually the people have pulled from within religious ideas the idea that we have to be there's an important element of religious identity is to be humble, to have humility in the face of diversity that God has created. And it might be that there are different ways in which people access God. So there are different kind of practices of tolerance that are not explicitly secular, and yet they are tolerant. They're not predicated on the idea of freedom of individual conscience, but they are predicated on the idea that different people will practice religions differently, and who knows which one is the best one? We don't know. Because we can't know, we have, they practice their way and we practice our way of religiosity.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Prof. It was wonderful learning more from you today, just as it's been immensely stimulating reading your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I very much enjoyed the conversation. And I've enjoyed watching that avocado and egg disappear as well.
Now there's tolerance for you. Bye now.